Welcome to the Fantasy Burn.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Fantasy Burn. I'm Brendan Booth. You can find me on Twitter at BigBonedFFB. Find my Substack at BigBonedFFB. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Today, my guest is OG Mitch Z. We're talking to Mitch Zimmer. Mitch and I are league mates in the Women of Fantasy Football Galvanize charity event. It's a pretty big event, and we wound up in the co-ed section because we're not eligible for the only women part. So as you can tell from his Twitter handle, OG Mitch Z, Mitch is an old school fantasy football player. So I wanted to bring him on to the Fantasy Burn, have him start talking about some of the fantasy football history. He's been around for a long time. So Mitch, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, when you started playing fantasy football. We'll get into some other things in a minute, but let everybody know who you are.
Thank you, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast. Really appreciate being invited. So hello, everybody. I'm Mitch, and I presently am retired. I live in Central Florida, a little less than an hour away from Minnie and Mickey, in a very large retirement community. Moved here in 2020 from the Philadelphia area, where I am still a big Eagles and Phillies fan. And that's where I cut my fantasy football teeth way back in 1988. A friend of mine approached me and said, I'm starting a fantasy football league with some other sports aficionados that I know that had interest in it. Do you mind if I send you the rules and the scoring system? And I'm like, well, fantasy football, what's that? I mean, anybody that hasn't been exposed to it and hears about it is like, what is that? But especially way back before the internet, way back before, Twitter or anything like that, very few people actually knew what it was all about. So I was like, And my wife said, yeah, no, but you like sports. We just moved to this area a couple of years ago. This is a good way to meet some people. And I said, all right, I'll give it a chance. He sent me the rules, which were it read like War and Peace. Because back then, if you started a fantasy football league, you kind of had to make up your own scoring system, make up your own rules. It wasn't the standardized industry that we've come to know and love these last, I don't know how many, 20 years or so, right?
Yeah.
So, he had a very, very long list of rules, and the scoring system was nothing like we would know it today. And how we actually put this league together. Well, first of all, if you were doing any kind of research, all you had were fantasy football magazines like this.
Maybe.
And then again, even that was a maybe. We lived in the Philadelphia area, so there was a sports talk station that was actually just getting started that very football season, which is probably one of the two oldest sports talk stations in the United States, and that's WIP in Philadelphia. And so that's where we got our Eagles talk, we got our football talk, but it was very Eagles slanted. So getting the information, maybe you had to get the sporting news, maybe you had to get USA Today, something like that, or a magazine. And how did we get our draft? We had an in-person draft with a flip chart, and we just did it the old school way. You came, sometimes you came with a list, sometimes you came with the rankings that you see in a magazine like this. And guys would draft somebody, and somebody would yell out, he retired last year. Oh, all right. Well, I didn't know that. He's still in the magazine. I'm going to draft Ian Howfield, the kicker for the Houston Oilers. They cut him last week and signed Raul Allegre, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So these are probably names many of you folks might never have heard. But that's the way the draft went. We had a lot of fun, a lot of beverages, a lot of pizza. And then it was time to do your transactions. Well, my friend that invited me in, he was the commissioner for the first couple of years. And I took over in 1991. And I'll explain that in a moment. But what you did was you called up a dedicated phone line. This guy actually had one with an answering machine. Then ultimately I did when I was commissioner, a separate line. You called up and you gave your transactions. And he arbitrated a lot of fights. There were a lot of guys who twisted the rules around. For example, this is how we got rid of our dead wood. We got rid of our dead wood by making trades like 2-for-1 or 3-for-2 unbalanced trades. Then you had an extra player on your roster, which was the other guy's dead wood. So you dropped the guy you just traded for.
Yeah.
It was just a very unproductive fantasy player. So we had to start tweaking rules after a bunch of fights. An example of how we tweaked that rule. Okay, well, if you traded for somebody, you had to keep them on your roster for at least 3 weeks. Well, that was fair, right? You just traded for the guy. But guys were helter-skelter trading for guys that they ended up dropping because the other guy didn't drop them. We back then charged $1 per transaction.
Sure. Your fab budget.
Didn't matter what the transaction was. So along the way, that stopped too. And then this guy was having a little marital problems. And his ex-wife and my wife were friendly and whatever. And the fast version is, Mitch, the guys like you, they trust you. Would you be interested in taking over as commissioner for 1 year while I settle things with my wife and whatever, and then I'll take the league back? And I said, look, okay, I'll do it for 1 year. That was in the 1991 season. Well, not only did he not come back as commissioner, but 2 years later, he quit the league. And I've been the commissioner ever since. And I tightened up a lot of rules. The scoring system remained the same antiquated scoring system that we had. As an example, you know how now it's 6 points for a rushing touchdown, 6 points for a receiving touchdown, 6 points for a kick return touchdown, maybe 4 or 6 points for a passing touchdown. It was nothing like that then. I mean, the way the guy made the rules up, the scoring system, it was 3 points for touchdowns. But the funny thing was, it was 2 points for sacks and tackles.
Whoa.
So, but that's the way we rolled.
Yeah.
So, but we had a lot of fun. Some guys came, some guys went, some guys died, believe it or not. And today, in 2023, we still have 5 of the original owners from back in 1988, including myself. And it's a 10-team league now. At its height, it was 14 teams. It was a dynasty. It was the original type of dynasty league. You kept your players, but you only kept a certain amount. You had to cap it off. You had to put in your to the commissioner which guys you were keeping, which guys you were throwing back. And the draft usually was rookies and some of the better free agents, because they were, I don't know, I think they were about 18-team rosters back then. Maybe it was 20. And you kept like 8. So there might have been some meat on the bone in the free agent list,
Sure.
in addition to the rookies that were coming in.
It sounds like it was a prototype of a keeper league, where keeper leagues have been pared down to smaller keeper
Right.
list, so 5 to 8, because you do want to have some meat on that bone when you draft the next
Yeah.
year. And if you have 18 men on your roster and you're keeping 14 of them, the draft's going to be kind of thin. So sounds like
Right.
it evolved over time to accommodate.
Right. It was kind of like a hybrid of a keeper and a dynasty league.
Yeah.
For example, in I don't remember what year it was, but I drafted a rookie named Drew Bledsoe for the Patriots. And a couple of years later, I picked up his backup when his backup was a rookie named Tom Brady. And Drew Bledsoe ended up getting injured. Tom Brady became Tom Brady. And I had him for years. I mean, years, until we didn't have a keeper or dynasty league there anymore. Now it's just a total redraft league and has been since 2012 or 2013. But I won a lot of money with Tom Brady. One year, the year that Tom Brady, I think, got injured in week 1 or week 2, it killed my season. I think I had number 2 in the draft the next year because I came in at the bottom, and I drafted a rookie named LaDainian Tomlinson. So I had Brady, Tomlinson. It was a 2-quarterback league. My other quarterback was Kurt Warner, and he was on the Greatest Show on Turf, threw a lot of touchdowns himself. I won a lot of money. And the fast version is now I have 2 Boston Terriers, and one is 10 and a half years old. And much to the chagrin of my sons, who were big Philadelphia Eagles fans and didn't like the fact that the Patriots beat the Eagles back about 15 years ago, whatever it was, in the Super Bowl, I named that dog Brady.
Well, to be fair, they should have been named Randall and Cunningham, but yeah, I played in this. I'm playing in the Scott Fish Bowl 13 this year, and the scoring format is pretty boosted. And I went back and I looked at LaDainian Tomlinson's 2007 season, applied the Scott Fish Bowl scoring to his statistics, and he would have been he outscored the top scorer in those statistics from 2022 by over 100 points. So if you had 2007 LaDainian Tomlinson with Scott Fish Bowl 13 scoring in last year's season, he would have outscored Josh Allen by over 100 points, which is absolutely insane.
I know.
Probably one of the greatest fantasy seasons of all time, barring Jerry Rice, because I know he's had a couple.
I never had Jerry Rice in those years. In the early years, I didn't know what I was doing, and I drafted a lot of winners, but the winners weren't necessarily the biggest fantasy scorers, especially based on the point system we had. Like the year the Giants won the Super Bowl, the very next year, or the Giants were in the Super Bowl, I had Phil Simms. Yeah, well, they won the Super Bowl, right? But Phil Simms wasn't exactly a fantasy marvel.
Right.
The fantasy, our winner, and way back then we had 14 teams. The guy that won that year had the quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who stunk to high heaven, Vinny Testaverde. But he threw like 40 touchdowns, 38 touchdowns, something like that. And he had a running back from a very bad Detroit Lions team named Barry Sanders. So he had good fantasy players.
Right.
But I was drafting guys from the 49ers, from the Giants, a couple of Buffalo Bills. As I said, it was an IDP league as well. I had Bruce Smith on my team as an example, when maybe I should have had Reggie White or Ronnie Lott, but I didn't, and so on and so forth. It wasn't until many years later where I finally got the hang of it. And I said, well, I got to start drafting good players that were fantasy relevant from crappy teams.
Right.
But remember, Brendan, this was a keeper type of league, a dynasty league. So a lot of the big fantasy scorers in their prime were being held on to by a lot of the other guys, and it was a deep league, 14 teams.
Right.
So it was very hard if you didn't have one of the more established fantasy scorers, like an Emmitt Smith or a Barry Sanders, as examples, or Jerry Rice, two guys that I never had.
Right. Well,
Uh,
I like the parallels to the modern game, things that have carried over through the history of fantasy football, and one of those is you want fantasy relevance versus quality as a player. A perfect example this year is Justin Fields. Justin Fields, top 10 quarterback in fantasy football, lower than 32nd in some metrics as a quarterback in real NFL football. So just because he's pretty terrible throwing the ball or had a bad, let's give him some credit and say he had a bad season last year. It doesn't mean that his fantasy stats didn't correlate to having a big season. So there are always those pitfalls where you look at a guy and you're like, that guy's really, really good, but his fantasy stats don't translate. And
right. And
been
that happens a
the same
lot.
story.
But last year, interestingly enough, the Super Bowl quarterbacks were Mahomes and Hurts. I would say Mahomes and Hurts, having had those guys on a couple of my dynasty teams, were pretty good fantasy scorers.
Sure.
One of the teams that I had Hurts on, I got into the Super Bowl but lost because some of my other good players either were hurt or didn't perform that particular week. A couple of leagues I had Hurts in, I didn't even make it past the Final Four or into the Final Four because you may remember he was hurt a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Didn't play. Minshew played, and Minshew played well enough to get the Eagles into the playoffs, but not good enough to get me into the fantasy football playoffs because I actually did have him rostered. He wasn't fantasy relevant, but certainly real football he was relevant, and so was the team. So you really never know.
Yeah.
But back then, when you didn't know, when you were kind of still new to it, I mean, I like Roger Craig was somebody I had. I figure, oh man, that's he's Roger Craig, but he really didn't become fantasy relevant until he went to the Vikings. As an example, much later in his career.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what I was. I just drafted well-known people on winning teams, and didn't always work out for me.
It doesn't always work out. It's interesting to see how the game has evolved, though, from hand tabulating on legal pads, doing waivers and trades and everything over the answering machine. I started playing basically at the advent of the internet. So once ESPN started doing their public leagues, it was around 1998, 1999, 2000. I started getting into the ESPN pick'ems and the public leagues. The ESPN used to have a platform where you basically it was fantasy, but it was rotisserie, but you weren't put into separate leagues. You played against everybody and you picked all your players. You had a certain budget to do it. So it was auction-ish, but you had to field the best team that you could for the certain budget that you had. And then each week you would score points. You could drop players, but you had to pick some up with the budget that you still had. It was very, very rudimentary online fantasy football rather than just having the team in the league going head to head against people, rotisserie scoring, that kind of thing. So that was about when I started. And then head to head became a thing. That changed the platform a little bit. And that was when I really kind of got dedicated to playing fantasy football. So I liked it. And now the Sleeper app is fantastic. It's just the game has changed so much for us, but some of the elements are still the same. Like you want to tabulate you want to get the points accumulated in the best way that you possibly can, and it doesn't really matter if you're an old head or a newbie. Everything kind of stays the same. It's wonderful.
Right. And you know what? I forgot to mention one very important aspect. This league that I've been in since 1988 is my one and only rotisserie style league. We still run it that way. It's not head to head. So there have been some times that we've had odd number of teams because it doesn't matter if you do when you're playing
Sure.
rotisserie style. And this is the way the old heads in my league are used to doing it. That's what we do. But as an incentive, and this has gone on since I became commissioner of this league in 1991, we give a weekly winner prize. That's part of the prize fund, is a weekly winner prize. Back in the day when we had a $250 buy-in, when we were all younger and making a lot of money in our jobs, we gave $25 out a week for weekly winners. Now the league is $100 buy-in, and we still give $15 for weekly winners. And sometimes even the team that's kind of down at the bottom or close to it might have a good week here or there and actually get to win the $15.
Sure.
So there's that. But yes, I know most fantasy baseball leagues still play rotisserie. But this league has been rotisserie since day one, and I still have it set up that way. And the other thing is, well, most every one of my other leagues that I am in is on the Sleeper platform. This has been on Yahoo since, like I say, 2012 or 2013. That's what the guys are used to, and I just keep it on Yahoo. And
So what is the name of the team in the league that you've had since 1988?
Mostly in the last 8 or 9 years, I've been Joe Buck Yourself.
Okay.
This is because when the Phillies were in the World Series, 2008, 2009, and the Eagles were in the Super Bowl, or the Eagles were relevant, or at least on the Fox broadcast on national television, usually against the Dallas Cowboys. The urban legend in Philadelphia is Joe Buck hates the Philadelphia teams. I try to watch with objectivity, and I don't believe he was against the Philadelphia teams whatsoever. But, you know, the Philadelphia fans can be a little rough, and they have a reputation for it. Some of it is not warranted, and some of it is. And it just, the whole anti-Joe Buck thing grew feet from his time as both the lead play-by-play for football and for baseball. And the Philadelphia fans have grown to not like him. And I just thought it was cute to make my team Joe Buck Yourself.
Yeah. So how many times have you changed the name over the years?
That league I keep as Joe Buck Yourself. But prior to that, I was the Nitmos for a lot of years. There was a kicker on the New York Giants, and I think he was on their team when they were against the Buffalo Bills in the Super Bowl one year. But I could be wrong about that. His name was Bjorn Nitmo. And he was one of those foreign-born soccer-style kickers. Now that's all they are. But back then there were still some straightaway kickers back then. As you know, in Oakland, they had George Blanda. But there was this guy, Bjorn Nitmo. And my friend and I were watching a football game that John Madden was the analyst in. And Bill Parcells was the coach. And the way Madden said, well, I could just see Parcells trying to get the kicker's attention to get him in the league, yelling, "Hey, Nitmo, get in there. Hey, Nitmo." I just was laughing at the delivery, just the way John Madden was. This is I can't do it justice, but this is an example of what made John Madden unique and what made him Madden, where he just blurt out, Parcells going, "Hey, Nitmo, get in there." So my friend and I started calling each other Nitmo. You know, you're a real Nitmo. And I said, you know what? Next year, I'm going to call my team the Nitmos. And for about 10, 12 years, I was the Nitmos, maybe longer. I just called myself the Nitmos.
Yeah, that's funny.
It was kind of funny. This is well after Bjorn Nitmo. You know, I think he finished his career with the Kansas City Chiefs. And I don't remember how I did it. I don't know if it was Google or Google's predecessors, but I searched out Bjorn Nitmo and I articulated with a guy who said he was Bjorn Nitmo, and he was very tickled with the fact that I named my fantasy team after him. I don't really know if it was Bjorn Nitmo or not, but he went by that name, and I told him who I was, and I made my fantasy team after Bjorn Nitmo, and it all goes back to just an off-the-cuff John Madden, one of a gazillion John Madden blurting out moments.
Yeah.
And they were, you know, so
yeah, I have a love for John Madden as a Raiders fan. I'm also from Northern California. I work in a grocery store, and I have a customer who actually played high school football on the same offensive line with John Madden. I get to talk to him all the time. He's got lots of good stories and stuff. And then I have another customer he took a class at UC Berkeley 30, 40 years ago about football and gave me the syllabus, which was put together by John Madden. And John Madden was the teacher of that class and handed out the syllabi to everybody.
Sure.
And so I have it. And it's John Madden's 1975 breakdown of the game of football, from what each position does, who the split end is, who the flanker is, who the H-back is, every defensive position, what different defensive formations are. It was a 9-week quarter class at UC Berkeley about the game of football. And so that's one of my prized possessions was this. John Madden put it together and wrote it and everything. And it just like he taught the class for that one season or that 1 year, 4 quarters.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love that thing. I love
John. You see, the thing about it is, say what you want in his later years about Al Davis, and say what you want about his son. But back in the day, it was very obvious that Al Davis knew talent, not only on the playing field, but on his coaching staff.
Yeah.
Okay. And it was very obvious to him that John Madden kind of knew what in the heck he was doing. And that hire was gold for the Raiders when they made him the head coach. And I know that they had success under Flores as well back in the day. They went to a Super Bowl with him. But I think John Madden had 3 distinct things he was known for in 3 different generations. When he was the coach of the Raiders, when he was a broadcaster for almost every, he was on CBS, Fox, and ABC for Monday Night Football, and he finished it off on NBC with Sunday Night Football. And there goes a little bit of an echo. And then, of course, the Madden, the video game, that everybody from this generation knows and loves. I remember another such television moment where he was the analyst, and this had something to do with your Raiders. The defense had just come off the field, and they were sitting on the sidelines, and the camera panned over to Otis Sistrunk, who was bald like this, and there was steam coming off his head. And everybody knows that Otis Sistrunk actually didn't play collegiate football for a big school, or if he played at all. John Madden said, "There he is, Otis Sistrunk from the University of Mars." And that was a thing. And I actually saw that game too. Because, of course, if Madden was on it was a national game. So wherever you lived, you most certainly saw the CBS game that John Madden was the color commentator along with Pat Summerall.
Sure.
And there's Otis Sistrunk from the University of Mars. And, with the steam coming off his head. And, now almost every NFL player shaves his head or has dreads. But back then, Otis was also one of a kind. You know, he was one of the toughest football players you're ever going to want to see on the defensive line, and he had that unique look with his shaved head.
The Raiders were mean.
They were all mean. I mean, believe me, Matuzak, all of them, Alzado, Ronnie Lott. They just were. They were something else.
Jack Tatum is
a lot of those guys. They couldn't play the way they played now with the rules.
Sure,
a lot of them.
Well, you take Jack Tatum and his violence, and Lester Hayes and his stickum, and they were violators.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the dirtiest players was one of their rivals, though, a guy named Atkinson, who played for Denver, who was one of the dirtiest players in the game.
George Atkinson.
Yeah, he went. I believe he was from USC, and where Ronnie Lott went also. But he was dirty as all get out. He would not last in the NFL playing the way he did either. But it's fun to think about and talk about the old days. I don't know how a lot of your followers on this podcast, how old they are, but I don't want to give anybody the impression that I'm not tuned into what goes on today as well.
Sure.
And everything. I'm fairly successful in the fantasy football I play. I don't win all the time, believe me. I get myself into leagues with some sharks. So, I don't walk into a league expecting to win. I just go to compete, have fun. The camaraderie is great.
Yeah,
it's just something I enjoy. I enjoy. I probably watch the Red Zone on Sundays as often as I'll try to find an Eagles game on TV.
Well, I don't think we're going to lose my 3 followers if we're talking about NFL history. But what's kind of interesting is a lot of people, when head coaches get hired by a new franchise, people start talking about the coaching trees that they came from. And not a lot of people understand the legacy in the NFL of Al Davis and how he has helped totally develop the game and change the game over the last 50 years, 55, 60 years. The visions that he had when he was putting together the Raiders, first in the AFL and then putting together his coaching staff when in the 60s. Bill Walsh was one of his early disciples, and then Bill Walsh and Sam Weish created the West Coast offense. Shanahan was a disciple of Bill Walsh, and now you have Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, all of the guys that coached together in Washington that are the new big deal, and all of that comes from the stem of Al Davis. And obviously Al Davis has had a mentor, and I'm not trying to diminish anybody else's legacy in the game, but Al Davis is quickly becoming a forgotten element of what we know as the NFL today, and it's good to see that there are people around still that understand that.
Well, you know what, Brendan, I'm probably the only guy around that you're ever going to talk to that actually does remember who Al Davis's mentor was. A guy named Sid Gilman.
Okay.
Because Al Davis did not start his professional coaching with the Raiders. The first year of the AFL, the team we know as the Chargers, the Los Angeles Chargers,
right,
actually were the Los Angeles Chargers in the first year of the AFL before they moved to San Diego. Sid Gilman was their coach.
Former quarterback?
I think he was, but I'm not sure. You may be confusing him with Sid Luckman.
That's
but
probably accurate.
Sid Gilman had on his staff Al Davis. And he was a young up-and-comer. And just like now, where good young up-and-comer assistant coaches get pirated away to become a head coach, the Raiders had a whole different ownership back then, long forgotten people that were on their own ownership group. They brought in Al Davis, and I think part of his deal after he became a little successful, he signed another contract, which included a piece of the ownership. And as things would happen, somewhere between 1962, when he became the coach of the Oakland Raiders, until the merger, which kind of happened in 1969, somewhere between then, well, 67 was the first Super Bowl, and the Raiders were in it in 68. Somewhere between those years, he ended up buying out the old ownership team of the team and becoming the sole owner of the Raiders. Because the AFL teams, believe it or not, it didn't cost a lot to own one.
Right.
It was kind of a hobby for like an oil man like Lamar Hunt, who is the owner of his son now is the owner of the Kansas City Chiefs, and so on and so forth. So, but it's not like it was now. I mean, the owners of the old New York Titans, which became the Jets, they became bankrupt and sold to the team that signed Joe Namath, the ownership group that signed Joe Namath, and then they sold years later to a pharmaceutical executive named Woody Johnson from the Johnson and Johnson, like your Band-Aids, from that family, and he still owns the team. But way back then, in the old days of the AFL, it didn't take a lot of scratch to own a team, and he was able to buy out the owners, and that's how he and now Mark Davis are the Raiders owners. But he got his start under Sid Gilman as the as one of the coaches on the Los Angeles Chargers from the first year.
So I did some quick research, and Sid Gilman played end. It just says end. It doesn't specify whether he was a tight end or a split end or a defensive end, but he played end. So he might have come from the two-way days and lined up as an end both ways. Well, Mitch, I wanted to ask if there's anything about having played fantasy football for 45 years,
35
years.
Yeah.
37 years. Is there anything about that experience that gives you an edge at this point against players that, maybe have been playing for 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah. I don't know if I'd call it an edge, but the longer you play, and even if you're only playing 5 and 10 years, you learn from your mistakes. And one of the big mistakes people make is they fall into a rut as the way they like to draft and construct their teams. But the pendulum sometimes swings a whole different way in the industry. And if you were so old school that you were always running back first, because the running back pool in a draft dries up faster, if you were top heavy in running backs and you still construct your team that way, you might now be at a disadvantage.
Sure.
You have to adapt to the way the industry, meaning the NFL, the real football, can translate out into fantasy football. So with fewer and fewer and fewer what they're now calling bell cow running backs, and even then the bell cow running backs either take a breather, don't get as many fantasy points because they might come off the field in third down, or their team might throw in third down to the receivers, or they might get hurt, or any or all of the above. The pendulum is swung towards loading up on the better wide receivers earlier in the draft, in the redraft leagues. If you don't adapt, if you don't learn from mistakes, if you stay stuck in the same rut, you're not going to be as successful. So you have to adapt. You have to you come with a plan, but the plan has to be malleable.
So the more changes that you've seen over the years makes you more able to adapt to changes in the game. And sure. That's there are a few things that speak to that, like the advent of zero RB drafting in the last couple of years. Those have become, pretty popular ways to put together a best ball draft, or that kind of thing. I think the next frontier is, and I've flag planted that this year, the new rookie class of tight ends is going to alter the way that we look at tight ends in fantasy, because typically you've had 3 to 5 tight ends who were relevant. And if you didn't get one of those, then streaming is totally a possibility in redraft. This new crop of tight ends, the game is evolving to take a tight end away from lining up in line and using them as a big slot. So everybody, when Dalton Kincaid was drafted, the Buffalo Bills are going to use him as a big slot. Well, Darren Waller had been doing that for a few years, the Raiders, and Dalton Kincaid is the next piece in the evolution of that position, a bigger matchup problem for linebackers and defensive backs as a slot receiver instead of just a small quick guy like a Hunter Renfrow type. So Sam Laporta, Luke Musgrave, Michael Mayer, Zach Kuntz, all these guys are coming out, and they're not going to be asked as rookies to block. And a lot of times the fantasy development of a tight end has been stunted by the fact that they need to learn the playbook, they need to learn the blocking schemes, and they need to show that they can do that in addition to catching 3, 4, 5, 6 passes per game. And it takes a while to get to that level. And these guys coming in are going to be immediate big slots, and they're going to see a lot more targets. They're not going to be asked to do the same. They're going to have another tight end in there to maintain that blocking assignment. Meanwhile, these guys can go out and run routes faster than linebackers and small and bigger than cornerbacks. So in the next couple of years, I think we're going to start having 8 to 12 relevant tight ends in fantasy every year. Meanwhile, the running backs are kind of fading away as
Right.
changes.
Right. I mean, the Philadelphia Eagles, and let's separate my fandom of that team for a moment, with a prototype to what you're talking about when they had both Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz together. Goddard ended up to be more of the slot guy that you just aptly described. And several other teams started going to variations of that. After Jason Witten left the Dallas Cowboys, you started to see a little of that also, especially last year when they had Hendershot and, Dalton Schultz. They kind of did that as well. Now that Zach Ertz is on Arizona, I wonder if they're going to do a little bit more of that this year with their second-year tight end, Trey McBride. Yeah. I have a lot of shares of Goddard and Trey McBride in Dynasty because of what you aptly described there in terms of their how it relates to their pass catching ability. Right. Just last problem with Trey McBride last year, he was on a team with a coaching staff that was a complete clown show, and I don't think they were able to tap into what they had with this guy. Now we'll see this year. I mean, Zach Ertz is injured right now. Hopefully, when they get their full complement of people, the way they should, we'll see what this guy Trey McBride can do. I don't have any pits on Atlanta. Everybody, see, this is another thing. You asked me, what have I learned? I learned don't get recency bias. A lot of people are fading Pitts because he hasn't really lived up to the expectations of his rookie year. But don't sleep on that guy. He's got talent.
Sure.
So,
and to be fair to Zach Ertz, it's not that he's not capable as a pass catcher. It's just his quote unquote breakout took a little bit longer because he had a different role in the Eagles offense.
Right.
And he is a capable pass catcher. He just also has to block. So some guys can do both of those things, but the new vanguard of tight end receiving in fantasy is going to be those big slot guys.
And to your point, to take it a step further with the Eagles, they're the prototype also for the successful team with a committee backfield.
Right.
Right. I mean, they went all the way to the Super Bowl this year. You could make the case that Miles Sanders was their bell cow back, but he wasn't as fantasy relevant as a bell cow back should be, because you saw a lot of the other guys. You saw Gainwell in there. You saw you saw Scott in there. So and their quarterback was a running quarterback that scored a lot of touchdowns himself. So they're the prototype for that, and they continue to be that now with their revamped backfield that they have now. You don't know if Swift is going to be their main guy, Penny is going to be their main guy. Will there be a main guy? Gainwell and Scott are still there.
Yeah.
But so that's just another team. Back in the day when they had Shady McCoy and before that Wilbert Montgomery, they were very, very, very fantasy relevant running backs.
Right.
Out of the Philadelphia Eagles. You just, in the Super Bowl winning Kansas City Chiefs, you can't really make a case that any of their running backs right now are bell cow running backs either. I mean, Derrick Henry is going to be a dinosaur. His role in his offense is going to be a dinosaur real soon.
James Conner too.
And it's going to be that slot tight end that everybody's going to say, that's the next big thing. If you don't draft McCaffrey in a redraft this year, or Derrick Henry or Eckler, then any other running back pretty much you're drafting, you can wait till a much later round and do the hero or zero running back thing, because there are other quote unquote first string running backs that'll be available in much later rounds. Like, you might not like their teams, you might not like them, but the Cam Akers of the world and the Montgomerys of the world and the Connors, the James Connors of the world, you could get them in later rounds.
Sure.
But, they're not the shiny toy anymore.
It reminds me a lot of the quarterback situation in redraft for a good 2 decades, where you didn't really have to take a quarterback until the 9th or 10th round or 11th round in redraft, because you were going to get somebody who's going to throw 4,000 yards and 25 to 35 touchdowns. They were all going to be fairly similar as far as where they put you in points. You were trying to get your value out of the running backs who were setting themselves apart and kind of win with a Todd Gurley or a LaDainian Tomlinson, that kind of thing. Where now, last year was really the last time you were going to be able to get Hurts as late as the 6th round or the 7th round. The way that running quarterbacks have changed the fantasy landscape is kind of, running backs are going the opposite way. You can wait on running backs, draft your quarterback.
Right. And it's true, because if you go back to the stats, the same way you did with LaDainian Tomlinson in terms of running backs, if you go, I won a lot of money with Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady. Then as they got older, the pendulum swung a little bit to where you saw not much of a gap in terms of annual or yearly fantasy points between the first ranked quarterback and maybe the 14th round ranked quarterback.
Right.
There wasn't a lot of fluctuation in fantasy value and points in QB1 to QB14, for example. People over the last, maybe not so much last year, but previous years, won a lot of money with Kirk Cousins, as an example.
Sure.
Or Derek Carr, as an example. You weren't winning Super Bowls with their teams or with those guys, but you might have won a fantasy Super Bowl if they were your quarterback. And in the first round, you drafted LT, or you drafted CMC, or you drafted Zeke Elliott in his prime.
Right.
And one of those guys was your quarterback, and you might have had, a really, really good wide receiver, or 2 really good wide receivers. Larry Fitzgerald might have been an example of somebody you might have had paired up with a younger Kirk Cousins and Zeke Elliott, and you were winning fantasy championships with with that kind of roster.
Absolutely.
So but now a lot of guys are like, well, I gotta get Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert, Justin Fields, uh, or else I'm going to be screwed. And we'll see. We'll see if change of scenery. Derek Carr will continue to produce. Maybe Jimmy Garoppolo will stay healthy, and he'll be what he was hoping to be in his new role. And the younger quarterbacks, the second-year quarterbacks or third-year quarterbacks, your Kenny Pickett's of the world will come on. So we'll see. But I'm not coming out of any redraft, or haven't come out of any redraft without at least having Hurts or Herbert or Burrow, somebody like that, or even I haven't been lucky enough to get Mahomes in a redraft. I only have him in one dynasty league.
Yeah, I think I have only a couple shares of him. So, Mitch, I asked you to come up with a power rankings for a variety of different topics, and you chose your all-time musical acts, artists. Just go ahead and tell me a little bit about each group and maybe a favorite song, a quick memory that you might have of the first time you heard them, or if you ever saw them live, that kind of thing. So at number 5, you have Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons.
Well, my whole list, as you'll end up seeing, reflects my age, and so the artists on the list, for the most part, are responsible for a lot of really good memories I had growing up. And as an East Coast guy, the Four Seasons were absolutely the bomb. They were terrific. They had a unique sound, as everybody knows. Frankie Valli was able to sustain for years and years and years and years. He still performs live. People got to know him in the next generation because of Jersey Boys, the movie, the Broadway show. They got to know and love the music, but I always did growing up, and brought back a lot of memories of my junior high school and high school years. They had quite a stretch of hits. I loved them all. He reinvented himself as a solo artist. You may remember the theme to the movie Grease. He sang that.
Okay.
Grease is the word. So, like I say, he reinvented himself there, and I just absolutely loved everything the Four Seasons did. Probably one of my favorite songs from the Four Seasons was a song called Opus 17, which was nowhere in the title, was nowhere in the song, but the lyrics were "Don't you worry about me." It was a nice upbeat tune, and I really, really liked that one. But I loved all of their songs. And during his solo years, again, when he reinvented himself, he sang a ballad called "My Eyes Adore You," which is from around 1975, 76, something like that. And I always liked that song as well.
And if I'm not mistaken, he grew up in the same neighborhood as Joe Pesci, who also was a singer.
And Joe Pesci was his friend. He had the Joe Pesci character had a very prominent part in the play and the movie Jersey Boys, and you would see that.
All right, number 4, you have the Temptations.
Same thing. I mean, string of hits. They had an incarnation of guys that came in and out of the group because of a couple of guys thought the lead singers thought they were bigger than the group, went ahead and created their own solo acts. David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks were two of them. But when they were together, they really gelled as a group. My love for them actually was rekindled last year because there was a Broadway show made about them too, as it were. And I saw it last year, and it was called "Ain't Too Proud," which is a takeoff on their one of their early hits, "Ain't Too Proud to Beg." And saw that, loved it, loved the show. There was a lot of pull back the curtain about the way they all articulated with one another, what happened when Eddie Kendricks and then David Ruffin and then Eddie Kendricks broke off on their own, but then they kind of came back together a little bit. But their string of hits was absolutely amazing, and I did see them in concert back in. There was a place in the Philadelphia area called the Valley Forge Music Center, where the acts actually were in a center stage, and it was in the round, and the stage would rotate every so often, so everybody got to see them front and center, and it was a very intimate. It was a very intimate venue for acts to come, and they played, and the Four Tops were with them. It was the Four Tops and the Temptations came on the same tour, and I saw them there live, probably around 1995, 6 or 7. It was when that show was. That's when I saw them live.
Yeah, so Billy Joel is your number 3, and let's hear about it.
One of my sons is a musician, and he's a keyboard player and a singer, and Billy Joel was his inspiration to become that way back in high school. When he was in high school, he's 41 years old now, but this was not even with him knowing that myself and his mother really always liked Billy Joel. Saw Billy Joel in concert several times when he came through the Philadelphia area in the venue that's now called the Wells Fargo Center. We last saw him right before we moved to Florida in the Citizens Bank Park where the Phillies play. So he did a stadium tour, which was actually a pretty famous stadium tour because he played Fenway Park and other venues, and he came to Philadelphia, and we saw him there. And just always loved Billy Joel. He was a guy also that was able to reinvent himself a couple of times. If you ever listen to the Billy Joel station when it comes around on Sirius XM, they have him telling stories about certain songs that he did and certain albums that he put out, and how he kind of evolved as a performer. And then my son was a big fish in a little pond in terms of being a performer in his high school. And at high school graduation of the class before him, when he was in 11th grade, he actually sang the song Lullaby, which is a Billy Joel song, at the graduation ceremony of that year. But he was a junior. It wasn't his class. And he sang Lullaby. And he told me, he was hooked after that. And he became probably the world's biggest Billy Joel fan, and does a lot of Billy Joel stuff in his act. And so it kind of ties generations together. The early years where his mother and I really, really loved Billy Joel, and now, where he's become a big fan. And I put him as number 3.
Yeah. And if you haven't heard it, go to Spotify or YouTube videos or whatever and look up Still Rock and Roll to Me. It's a 40-year-old banger. That song still gets me. It's number 2, one of the biggest bands of all time, the Rolling Stones.
My love for the British invasion era is unmatched. And the Rolling Stones were totally unique when you compare them to most of the other British invasion acts, like the Beatles, like Herman's Hermits, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and so on. They were just the bad boys of rock and roll, and they brought it. They brought it with every record, every album. And they were the prototypes for the next generation of acts like Aerosmith, for example. But my tippy top, was probably the acts like the Rolling Stones that really were the signatures of my high school and early college days. Brought back a lot of memories. Certain albums and certain songs bring back memories of certain girls I dated, or certain things I did, places I went. So the Rolling Stones, they just brought it with everything they ever did, every song, every album, and the couple of times I saw them in concert. Uh, I mean, if the Rolling Stones, now, see, they came to Tampa last year, and we wanted to see them till we saw what the price of the tickets were, and we said, I'm on a fixed income now. I don't need to spend that kind of money. We'll take a pass. Mick Jagger, everybody says, well, he's so skinny because he did all those drugs. I got news for you. Strutting around that stage for several hours under the hot lights for years and years and years in concert and whatever, he keeps you skinny also. So
Yeah.
there's a little of all of that.
The best cardio is being a rock star. All right. And your number one, probably number one on very many power rankings lists, the Beatles.
And that is why. I mean, there's the reason why most people love the Beatles are the very same reasons I did as well. They came to the U.S. when I was in 5th grade. My mother was okay with the Beatles. She didn't turn it off when they came on the radio. I would listen. She would love it too. In fact, she had no problem. I don't know if you remember, there was a style that they wore back when they first came here. They wore these kind of suits, all the same suit, and they had something that was called Beatle boots. Mm-hmm. There were these boots that were indigenous to them because when they came to the States, they were called Beatle boots, and they were a big fashion thing. And I had Beatle boots. My mother let me buy them. And I, when I was in junior high school, I had Beatle boots. Then they kind of switched over to these like suede kind of things that they wore for a while also. And I had these kind of suede shoes that I wore to school also because the Beatles did. And then, of course, they evolved over the years. They went from that to their long hair psychedelic days. And I grew my hair, and I don't wear glasses anymore because I had cataract surgery. But, my younger years, I had the granny glasses that John Lennon had. And my mother always used to say that I looked like John Lennon from the Let It Be cover with the granny glasses and the longer hair. You wouldn't know it now, but I did have hair down to there. And the Beatles evolved and didn't disappoint. And then they broke up, but they still didn't disappoint because I'm probably one of those guys that actually liked every one of their solo careers, which are so different from one another.
Sure.
But yet liked every one of their solo careers for what they are.
Yeah. Ringo's All-Star Band was great. And right. I'm not a huge fan of Wings. I do much prefer John Lennon's stuff,
right,
with Plastic Ono Band and all that. And George Harrison was great. And then in the 80s, kind of lost me with the 80s were just a terrible time for stars trying to get their music back. Some of that stuff is almost unlistenable. But
well, this is the thing. George Harrison had the triple album, right? The All Things Must Pass. The reason why he did that, and I've read a lot of books on the Beatles too, and was controversial as him being the younger guy in the band. Okay, John Lennon gave him an edict, and I don't remember the extent. It depends on what book you read. Will tell you the extent to which Paul McCartney backed up John Lennon in this point, but he only wanted George Harrison to have no more than 2 of his own songs on a Beatle album. Most of the time it was one, but 1 or 2, never more than 2. So especially towards the end, in the White Album years and the Abbey Road years, when they were actually all solo artists on a conglomeration albums, George Harrison, of course, had a couple of his hits on the White Album and on Abbey Road. Something, the song "Something" might have been one of the biggest songs of all of the ones from that
Yeah.
era, and that was a George Harrison song.
Right. And While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and
Right. But he, on the White Album, he had that one. But there weren't many others. It was mostly John Lennon stuff and some Paul McCartney stuff. And it was very easy to see which one was which at that point. The harmony was gone because they didn't really play with one another, or, you know, or they didn't take each other's stuff seriously anymore. And George Harrison was crafting as much stuff as the other guys were, but he didn't get to put a lot of it on those albums. So when he broke into his solo act, he had the Concert for Bangladesh and the album that went with it, but then the All Things Must Pass, where he sang "Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth," and it was a triple album with all his stuff, but the good stuff only probably could have been put onto one album.
right. Right.
And as far as Wings is concerned, I would disagree a little bit, because I do love his upbeat stuff from Wings, like Junior's Farm and Jet. You know, I did like that stuff.
Yeah.
I love the song Jet. I can hear it over and over again. And Hell on Wheels.
And Live and Let Die is good.
But that first album, just called McCartney, where he sang himself and overdubbed all of the instruments, played them all and including the drums, and overdubbed them onto that album. It was just him on that album. No Denny Lane, no Linda McCartney. It was just him. There were a couple of really, really nice songs on that album. And if you're not as familiar, it was his first solo album, and you should give that a chance. John Lennon basically had two really good solo albums. One was the double album, Double Fantasy, and the other was the one, you know, and the other one with I forget what it's called. I think it was just called Plastic Ono Band.
Plastic Ono Band.
But he those two, and one of those two was released actually after he was killed. Right after, I mean, literally right after. Yeah. And I love that album, and I liked a lot of his stuff. Now, Ringo had his solo career. A lot of it was really an ode to country music. And you would think, if you didn't know any better, that Ringo Starr was from Nashville, Tennessee, listening to a lot of his solo stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of it was recorded in the famous recording studio where Elvis and a lot of them recorded in Nashville. But you know, Ringo had some very funny stuff. My wife and I, we love the No song. You know, it's just a fun song.
That's one of the more endearing things about Ringo, is that since 1963, when they landed here, he has never taken himself seriously, and it's very refreshing to have somebody who's just so wry all the time and sarcastic and just like fun loving and everything. Like he's one of the gems to come out of that era. He's just such a fun guy to witness. Whereas
the other three took themselves very seriously, right. Their own selves very seriously, and you know, and again, once again, it depends on what historian and biographer you want to read. But you get a lot of flavor as to their egos that often would get in the way, and it would ruin a lot of the type of music that they were putting out earlier in their careers, with the harmonies and the way they played their musical instruments, and it sounded like they were having so much fun. To me, the 8 days a week stuff, those years, the I Want to Hold Your Hand, all that stuff was just magic to me. Yeah. And when they went psychedelic, the ego started coming out, the goofiness started coming out, and yes, they did produce a lot of really classic stuff out of those eras. But to me, what made the Beatles was their ability to work together, and that slowly started falling apart. 1967, 68. By 1969, it was all done, and in 1970, those last couple of Beatles albums were released at the same time that McCartney, Lennon, and Harrison all came out with solo albums. Bing Bang Boom, right at the same time. The Let It Be album came out, and it just it kind of tainted their legacy a little bit. But now a whole generation of new people can also hear all about the Beatles, and the old timers like me can relive the Beatles on a Sirius XM channel also. So I'm really happy that they have that channel, and I do listen to it quite a bit.
Yeah, that was my first musical experience. Really was discovering my father's record collection, and as I'm sifting through it, the number of albums that he had that were Beatles records exceeded anything. I mean, he had like 12 or 15 Beatles records, which was more than anything else. So that was, of course, the thing that I gravitated to. And so I, starting from the earliest time that I could put my, intentionally play music for myself to listen to, it started out as the Beatles. They were the foundation of my musical journey in life. And I love the Beatles. I love every era of the Beatles. But one of the things that I love the most is how they evolved as a band. And my two favorite records are Abbey Road and Let It Be. And I think it's because of the maturity of the music that they evolved to over the 10 years that they were together. You can, if you listen to the Beatles discography, you can hear the simplicity of the early stuff, and then you hear how they changed and created some of the greatest rock songs ever on Abbey Road and Let It Be, and they were phenomenal.
Absolutely, Abbey. There was a song called "Oh Darling." It was kind of a Paul McCartney screamer, but I love that song.
Yeah.
And in my college fraternity, I was known for getting a little bit drunk or a little bit high and getting up on a table or standing on a sofa, where, depending on where we were or what we were doing, and just crooning out "Old Darling." Because of course that album came out right as I was starting college.
Yeah.
And it endured all through the time I was in college, even though it was released at one point. It just endured, and it was a fun song, and it was a fun thing to do, and you know what? And the girls actually liked it too, and
Yeah.
It brought back, when I hear that song, it brings back memories of not only that album and how much I enjoyed it as well, but me standing on sofas or whatever and just belting it out.
Yeah. So if you ever want to impress a girl, my younger follower, learn the lyrics and the melody to "Oh Darling" and sing it to her. Give her a little serenade, and you'll have her.
Yeah, just don't go to the White Album and sing "Why Don't We Do It in the Road." That won't do it. That won't work. But
well, Mitch, this has been absolutely fantastic to get to know you and have you on and all that stuff. And I definitely want to work together in the future and
sure.
have you do some more stuff. Go ahead and remind everybody once again where they can see you, find you, talk to you, send you DMs, and
Right.
And dive into some of the knowledge in that brain of yours.
Thank you. If you watch the scroll going by on X or Twitter at OG Mitch Z, that's OG Mitch Z. I been the OG for a while. Certain people in fantasy just call me the original gangsta of fantasy football, and I guess it's stuck. And that's been my Twitter handle. So that's where you can find me. And I'd love to communicate with anybody that wants to talk a little fantasy football, talk a little Beatles or Rolling Stones, whatever you want. And and I'm really, really honored to have been on this pod with you today, and I'd be happy to come back anytime you want me.
Awesome. I'm happy to have you. Everybody else, go ahead and like, subscribe, share, and comment. And thank you for coming into the Fantasy Burn. Mitch, I will talk to you later. Have a great